The words hung in the air like shattered crystal, each shard cutting deeper than the last. I'd heard cruel things before, endured thoughtless comments, weathered storms of indifference, but nothing had prepared me for the venom in my husband's voice when he said he'd rather press his lips against our golden retriever than touch me. The charity gala buzzed around us, champagne flutes clinking, designer gowns swishing across marble floors, and there I stood in my custom Valentino dress, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. What my husband didn't know, couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that his empire of luxury hotels and exclusive resorts had been built on a foundation I'd quietly helped construct. And foundations, I would soon learn, can be dismantled stone by stone when the architect finally decides to walk away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Hayes, though back when this story began, I still carried the optimism of Victoria Portland, a girl from Oregon who believed in fairy tales and second chances. I met Dominic Carter at an art exhibition in downtown Portland 7 years ago. I was 26, working as a cultural consultant for boutique hotels, helping them curate authentic local experiences for their guests. He was 32, already making waves in the hospitality industry with 2 successful properties in Seattle and plans to expand into luxury markets. He approached me while I stood before a massive canvas depicting the Oregon coastline in abstract blues and grays. The painting reminded me of home, of the small beach house where I grew up watching storms roll in across the Pacific. Dominic's opening line wasn't smooth or practiced. He simply asked if I thought the artist had ever actually seen the ocean or was working purely from imagination. We spent 3 hours talking that night, closing down the gallery, then moving to a quiet wine bar where conversation flowed easier than the Pinot Noir we shared. Dominic was different from anyone I'd dated before. He had vision, ambition that felt contagious rather than intimidating. He spoke about transforming the hospitality industry, creating spaces that weren't just places to sleep but destinations that told stories. His passion aligned perfectly with my own beliefs about authentic cultural experiences. Within weeks, we were inseparable. Within months, he was asking for my input on his next property acquisition. Within a year, he proposed on the same beach that had inspired the painting where we first met. Our wedding was intimate, just 40 guests at a restored vineyard in Willamette Valley. Dominic's parents flew in from Boston, old money types who smiled politely but never quite warmed to the girl from Portland whose father repaired fishing boats and whose mother taught elementary school. My parents, bless them, were simply happy I'd found someone who made me smile. They didn't understand the business world Dominic operated in, couldn't quite grasp the scale of his ambitions, but they saw how he looked at me during our vows and that was enough. The first 3 years of our marriage felt like a partnership in the truest sense. I left my consulting job to work directly with Dominic, though my role remained unofficial, unpaid, more shadow advisor than recognized executive. I didn't mind initially. The work itself was fulfilling. I helped him acquire a struggling resort in Sedona, redesigning the entire guest experience around authentic Southwest culture rather than generic luxury. The property became profitable within 8 months, earning features in Travel and Leisure and Condé Nast Traveler. Dominic credited the turnaround to his business acumen during investor meetings. In private, he'd kiss my forehead and whisper that I was his secret weapon. We moved to Miami when Dominic acquired a Art Deco hotel in South Beach, his first major Florida property. The building had history, character, and staggering structural problems that most investors fled from. I spent 6 months researching Miami's cultural evolution, connecting with local artists, Cuban musicians, Haitian painters, Caribbean chefs. The hotel's redesign celebrated Miami's multicultural heartbeat rather than trying to replicate generic beach resort aesthetics. We called it the Meridian, and it became an instant landmark. Celebrities posted Instagram photos from our rooftop bar. Destination weddings booked 3 years in advance. Revenue exceeded projections by 40% in the first year alone. That success launched Lux Carter Hotels and Resorts into a different stratosphere. Suddenly, Dominic had investors circling, offering capital for rapid expansion. He acquired properties in Charleston, Savannah, and Key West within 18 months. Each time, I immersed myself in the location's cultural identity, building relationships with local artisans and historians, crafting experiences that felt genuine rather than manufactured. Each time, the properties flourished. And each time, Dominic's acknowledgement of my contributions grew quieter, more perfunctory, until it disappeared entirely. We bought the penthouse in Miami Beach during our 4th year of marriage. Waterfront views, 3,000 square feet, floor-to-ceiling windows that turned sunrise into a daily spectacle. Dominic insisted we needed a home that reflected our success, though I noticed he said "our" less frequently as his empire expanded. The penthouse came fully furnished with contemporary pieces selected by an interior designer I never met. My suggestions for incorporating personal touches, art from our travels, handmade pieces from local craftspeople were dismissed as not aligned with the aesthetic vision. Around this time, Dominic hired Candace Wellington as his director of guest relations. Candace came from a prominent Charleston family, had graduated from an elite hospitality management program, and possessed the kind of polished confidence that made waiters stumble and valets rush to assist her. She was beautiful in that specifically cultivated way, where every highlight placement and wardrobe choice seemed strategically calculated for maximum impact. During her interview, which I sat in on, she spoke eloquently about luxury service standards and high net worth client expectations. She barely looked at me. Dominic was impressed immediately. He offered her a salary that made my unpaid status suddenly feel more pointed. Candace started the following Monday, quickly establishing herself as indispensable. She accompanied Dominic to investor meetings, property tours, industry conferences. When I suggested joining a trip to scout potential properties in Barcelona, Dominic explained that Candace's expertise in European luxury markets made her the logical choice for the delegation. I stayed in Miami, continuing my cultural research for a new property acquisition in New Orleans, work that would never appear on any organizational chart or earn me any official recognition. The changes in Dominic were gradual enough that I questioned my own perceptions initially. He started coming home later, usually with reasonable explanations about investor dinners or property management issues. Our conversations became more transactional, focused on logistics rather than dreams. Physical intimacy declined, then nearly disappeared. When I tried to discuss it, Dominic attributed everything to stress, expansion pressures, the demands of building an empire. He suggested I was being needy, overly emotional, unable to understand the sacrifices required for success at his level. I tried to be understanding, to give him space while the business consumed his attention. I threw myself deeper into the cultural research work, spending long days exploring Miami's neighborhoods, interviewing local historians, documenting authentic experiences that could differentiate our properties from competitors. I compiled detailed reports that Dominic rarely read, presented ideas during strategy meetings where executives I'd never met claimed credit for concepts I'd developed. My confidence eroded slowly, like beach sand retreating with each wave. 6 months after Candace joined the company, Dominic announced we'd be hosting a major charity gala at the Meridian to raise funds for hurricane relief in the Caribbean. The event would showcase our property to Miami's elite social circle while demonstrating corporate responsibility. Planning consumed 3 months. I coordinated with local musicians, arranged for Caribbean artists to display work throughout the venue, designed a menu featuring dishes from affected islands with proceeds going directly to relief efforts. Dominic approved my plans with distracted nods, more focused on the guest list and which investors would attend. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully in an emerald Valentino gown that Dominic had picked out, though I suspected his assistant had actually made the selection. My hair was styled in an elegant updo, makeup applied with professional precision. I looked the part of a successful hotelier's wife, even if I felt increasingly like set decoration in my own life. Dominic barely glanced at me when I emerged from our bedroom, already on his phone addressing some last-minute crisis. The Meridian looked spectacular that evening. String lights wrapped around palm trees in the courtyard, live steel drum music floated through the warm Miami air, and the rooftop had been transformed into an elegant dining space with views of the ocean darkening into night. Guests arrived in luxury cars, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, ready to write large checks while enjoying world-class hospitality. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's success. Dominic worked the room with practiced charm, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on the company's explosive growth, posing for photos with local politicians and celebrities. Candace remained at his side throughout, laughing at his jokes, whispering updates about various guests, her hand resting on his arm with casual familiarity that made my stomach clench. I circulated separately, thanking vendors, checking on details, ensuring the Caribbean artists felt welcomed and supported. Nobody asked about my role in planning the event. Most guests assumed I was simply Dominic's wife, present for appearances rather than contribution. The incident happened during the silent auction. I'd been examining the pieces up for bid, pleased to see healthy competition for paintings by a Haitian artist I'd personally recruited. Dominic appeared at my elbow, his cologne overpowering in the humid evening air, his manner agitated in a way I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his hand gripping my elbow with enough pressure to leave marks I'd discover later. He guided me away from the crowd, through the lobby, into a private alcove near the administrative offices. His face was flushed, whether from alcohol or anger I couldn't immediately determine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's wrong?" I asked, genuinely concerned something had gone wrong with the event. "Did something happen with the auction? Is there a problem with the caterers?" Dominic's laugh was harsh, bitter in a way I'd never heard from him before. "The problem, Victoria, is you. The problem is that I've been watching you all night, seeing you flutter around like you're actually important to any of this, and I'm exhausted by the pretense." The words landed like physical blows. I stepped back, my shoulders hitting the wall behind me. "What are you talking about? This event was my idea. I coordinated everything." "You coordinated details," he corrected sharply. "You played hostess. That's not the same as running a business, building an empire. Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? The investors I'm managing, the expansion plans, the market positioning? And you want appreciation for picking out tablecloths and hiring a band?" His contempt was so absolute, so unexpected, that I couldn't immediately formulate a response. This wasn't the man I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd simply been too naive to see clearly. "Candace understands what I'm building," Dominic continued, his voice dropping lower. "She anticipates needs before I voice them, provides strategic value, operates at a level you've never even aspired to. Do you know what she told me tonight? She said I should be grateful for everything I've accomplished, that I've built something extraordinary. When was the last time you said anything like that? All you do is make demands on my time and attention when I'm trying to run a company." "I make demands," I repeated slowly, my mind struggling to process this alternate reality he was describing. "Dominic, I haven't asked you for anything in months. I've been working on the New Orleans project, doing research, developing concepts." "Research that no one asked for," he interrupted. "Concepts that slow down our acquisition process with unnecessary complications about cultural authenticity. Investors don't care about authentic experiences, Victoria. They care about returns. Something Candace understands instinctively." The mention of Candace clarified everything with sudden, brutal clarity. This wasn't about business pressures or my inadequate contributions. This was about her, about whatever had developed between them while I'd been too focused on work to recognize the obvious signs. "Are you sleeping with her?" I asked directly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Is that what this is really about?" Dominic's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before hardening into something uglier. "That's your response? Jealous accusations? This is exactly why we can't have adult conversations anymore. You're so insecure, so desperate for validation that you can't handle me having a professional relationship with a competent woman." "That's not an answer," I pressed, something fierce rising in my chest despite the pain. "Are you having an affair with Candace Wellington?" He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I heard the truth louder than any confession. Then he spoke, and his words would replay in my mind thousands of times in the months that followed. "You want honesty, Victoria? Fine. Being intimate with you has become a chore. You're needy, you're clingy, and you represent everything about my past I'm trying to move beyond." Dominic attributed everything to stress, expansion pressures, the demands of building an empire. He suggested I was being needy, overly emotional, unable to understand the sacrifices required for success at his level. I tried to be understanding, to give him space while the business consumed his attention. I threw myself deeper into the cultural research work, spending long days exploring Miami's neighborhoods, interviewing local historians, documenting authentic experiences that could differentiate our properties from competitors. I compiled detailed reports that Dominic rarely read, presented ideas during strategy meetings where executives I'd never met claimed credit for concepts I'd developed. My confidence eroded slowly, like beach sand retreating with each wave. 6 months after Candace joined the company, Dominic announced we'd be hosting a major charity gala at the Meridian to raise funds for hurricane relief in the Caribbean. The event would showcase our property to Miami's elite social circle while demonstrating corporate responsibility. Planning consumed 3 months. I coordinated with local musicians, arranged for Caribbean artists to display work throughout the venue, designed a menu featuring dishes from affected islands with proceeds going directly to relief efforts. Dominic approved my plans with distracted nods, more focused on the guest list and which investors would attend. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully in an emerald Valentino gown that Dominic had picked out, though I suspected his assistant had actually made the selection. My hair was styled in an elegant updo, makeup applied with professional precision. I looked the part of a successful hotelier's wife, even if I felt increasingly like set decoration in my own life. Dominic barely glanced at me when I emerged from our bedroom, already on his phone addressing some last-minute crisis. The Meridian looked spectacular that evening. String lights wrapped around palm trees in the courtyard, live steel drum music floated through the warm Miami air, and the rooftop had been transformed into an elegant dining space with views of the ocean darkening into night. Guests arrived in luxury cars, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, ready to write large checks while enjoying world-class hospitality. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's success. Dominic worked the room with practiced charm, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on the company's explosive growth, posing for photos with local politicians and celebrities. Candace remained at his side throughout, laughing at his jokes, whispering updates about various guests, her hand resting on his arm with casual familiarity that made my stomach clench. I circulated separately, thanking vendors, checking on details, ensuring the Caribbean artists felt welcomed and supported. Nobody asked about my role in planning the event. Most guests assumed I was simply Dominic's wife, present for appearances rather than contribution. The incident happened during the silent auction. I'd been examining the pieces up for bid, pleased to see healthy competition for paintings by a Haitian artist I'd personally recruited. Dominic appeared at my elbow, his cologne overpowering in the humid evening air, his manner agitated in a way I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his hand gripping my elbow with enough pressure to leave marks I'd discover later. He guided me away from the crowd, through the lobby, into a private alcove near the administrative offices. His face was flushed, whether from alcohol or anger I couldn't immediately determine. "What's wrong?" I asked, genuinely concerned something had gone wrong with the event. "Did something happen with the auction? Is there a problem with the caterers?" Dominic's laugh was harsh, bitter in a way I'd never heard from him before. "The problem, Victoria, is you. The problem is that I've been watching you all night, seeing you flutter around like you're actually important to any of this, and I'm exhausted by the pretense." The words landed like physical blows. I stepped back, my shoulders hitting the wall behind me. "What are you talking about? This event was my idea. I coordinated everything." "You coordinated details," he corrected sharply. "You played hostess. That's not the same as running a business, building an empire. Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? The investors I'm managing, the expansion plans, the market positioning? And you want appreciation for picking out tablecloths and hiring a band?" His contempt was so absolute, so unexpected, that I couldn't immediately formulate a response. This wasn't the man I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd simply been too naive to see clearly. "Candace understands what I'm building," Dominic continued, his voice dropping lower. "She anticipates needs before I voice them, provides strategic value, operates at a level you've never even aspired to. Do you know what she told me tonight? She said I should be grateful for everything I've accomplished, that I've built something extraordinary. When was the last time you said anything like that? All you do is make demands on my time and attention when I'm trying to run a company. I make demands, I repeated slowly, my mind struggling to process this alternate reality he was describing. Dominic, I haven't asked you for anything in months. I've been working on the New Orleans project, doing research, developing concepts. Research that no one asked for, he interrupted. Concepts that slow down our acquisition process with unnecessary complications about cultural authenticity. Investors don't care about authentic experiences, Victoria. They care about returns. Something Candace understands instinctively. The mention of Candace clarified everything with sudden, brutal clarity. This wasn't about business pressures or my inadequate contributions. This was about her, about whatever had developed between them while I'd been too focused on work to recognize the obvious signs. Are you sleeping with her? I asked directly, my voice steadier than I felt. Is that what this is really about? Dominic's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before hardening into something uglier. That's your response? Jealous accusations? This is exactly why we can't have adult conversations anymore. You're so insecure, so desperate for validation that you can't handle me having a professional relationship with a competent woman. That's not an answer, I pressed, something fierce rising in my chest despite the pain. Are you having an affair with Candace Wellington? He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence I heard the truth louder than any confession. Then he spoke, and his words would replay in my mind thousands of times in the months that followed. You want honesty, Victoria? Fine. Being intimate with you has become a chore. You're needy, you're clingy, and you represent everything about my past I'm trying to move beyond. Every relationship I built with local communities. Every cultural consultant and artist contact. Correspondence showing my strategic input on property acquisitions. Vendor contracts I negotiated. Financial analyses proving my concepts drove revenue growth at underperforming properties. Dominic glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. So what? You kept some files. That doesn't change anything. It changes everything, I corrected. Because I also know things that investors might find interesting. Like how the Meridian success was built on cultural partnerships I developed personally. Or how the Sedona property turnaround came from concepts you initially dismissed. Or how your rapid expansion has been funded by overselling my work as your strategic brilliance. His face flushed, anger replacing confusion. You're threatening me? After everything I've given you? You've given me nothing, I replied, my voice hardening. I earned everything I contributed to your empire. And now I'm taking it back. Every relationship, every contact, every shred of goodwill I built in communities your hotels occupy. You're going to discover very quickly how much of your foundation I actually constructed. The confrontation escalated from there, Dominic alternating between threats and pleading, between dismissing my claims and trying to negotiate. But I was done negotiating, done accepting crumbs while he took credit for the meal. By the end of that morning, I'd moved out of the penthouse, taking only my personal belongings and Charlie, who Dominic had never paid attention to anyway. I checked into a modest hotel in downtown Miami, nothing fancy, just clean and functional. I sat on the generic bedspread, Charlie curled at my feet, and called the one person I'd maintained a friendship with outside of Dominic's sphere of influence. Gabrielle Romano had been my college roommate, the friend who'd stood beside me at my wedding even though she'd quietly expressed doubts about Dominic from the beginning. Gabby had built her own career in digital marketing, specializing in authentic brand storytelling. She lived in Austin now, running a successful boutique agency. When I explained what had happened, there was a long silence before she spoke. Come to Austin, she said simply. Stay with me while you figure things out. And Victoria? Burn his empire to the ground. You built it. You can absolutely dismantle it. Her words struck something deep inside me. Not vengeance exactly, but justice. Recognition. The reclamation of value that had been stolen and credit that had been denied. I'm going to need help, I told her. Legal help, strategic help. This isn't just about divorce. This is about showing Dominic exactly what happens when you underestimate the foundation of your own success. Gabi's laugh was fierce, proud. Then let's get to work. I know people. And Victoria? I've been waiting years for you to remember who you are beyond being Dominic Carter's wife. Welcome back. That phone call marked the beginning of everything that followed. The dismantling of an empire. The reclamation of my identity. The discovery that sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead to the most profound transformations. Dominic had told me he'd rather kiss a dog than touch me, treating me like something disposable, easily replaced. What he failed to understand was that disposable things rarely hold up the structures we depend on. And when foundations crumble, empires fall. My story was just beginning. The drive from Miami to Austin took 17 hours straight through, with only brief stops for gas and to let Charlie stretch his legs at rest areas along Interstate 10. I drove through the night, watching the landscape transform from Florida's humid coastline through the Gulf states and finally into the sprawling expanse of Texas. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from Dominic, texts that evolved from angry to pleading to threatening. I ignored them all, focusing on the white lines of the highway and the growing certainty that leaving wasn't running away but running towards something I'd forgotten existed. Gabrielle lived in a renovated warehouse in East Austin, the kind of space that had been transformed from industrial to residential with exposed brick walls and massive windows that flooded the open floor plan with natural light. She was waiting on the street when I pulled up just after dawn, 2 cups of coffee already in hand. We didn't speak at first, just hugged on the sidewalk while Charlie explored his new surroundings with cautious optimism. Gabby had always understood me in ways that required few words, a friendship forged during late-night college study sessions and maintained through quarterly video calls even as our lives diverged. Her guest room was simple but comfortable, and after months in the sterile perfection of the Miami penthouse, the warmth of mismatched furniture and personal touches felt like exhaling after holding my breath too long. I collapsed onto the bed fully clothed and slept for 14 hours straight, the kind of deep unconscious rest that comes from emotional exhaustion rather than physical tiredness. When I finally emerged, Gabby had takeout containers spread across her dining table, Thai food from a place she swore made the best pad Thai outside of Bangkok. We ate in comfortable silence initially, Charlie stationed hopefully beneath the table waiting for accidents. Finally, Gabby set down her fork and looked at me directly. "Tell me everything," she said simply. "Not the sanitized version, not the story you've been telling yourself to make it hurt less. The real version." So I did. I told her about the gradual erosion of recognition, about watching my contributions be claimed by others, about Dominic's transformation from partner to dismissive critic. I told her about Candace Wellington and the obvious affair I'd willfully ignored, about the gala and the cruel comparison to our dog. I told her about the cold clarity that had replaced hurt, about the documentation I'd kept and the realization that I held more leverage than anyone suspected. Gabby listened without interruption, her expression shifting from sympathy to anger to something that looked like strategic calculation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd shared. "You know what your biggest problem is," she finally said. "You still think of yourself as Dominic's wife first and Victoria Portland second. You've forgotten that you had a thriving career before him, that cultural consultancy firms were trying to hire you, that you turned down opportunities because he convinced you working together was more important." The word struck something true and uncomfortable. She was right. I'd subsumed my identity so completely into being Dominic's partner that I'd forgotten who I'd been independently. The girl who'd triple majored in anthropology, art history, and business because she couldn't choose just one passion. The consultant who'd helped a struggling boutique hotel in Portland become the highest-rated property in the Pacific Northwest by focusing on authentic local experiences rather than manufactured luxury. "I'm not that person anymore," I said quietly. That Victoria was confident, ambitious. "I don't know if I can find her again." Gabby shook her head firmly. "You're still her. You've just been convinced to hide her under someone else's definition of success. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to remind every single person in the hospitality industry exactly who Victoria Portland is and what she's capable of building without Dominic Carter taking credit. The next morning, Gabby connected me with Marcus Thornton, an attorney who specialized in intellectual property and business disputes. Marcus worked out of a sleek office in downtown Austin, all glass and chrome with a view of the Colorado River. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with the confident manner of someone who'd won far more cases than he'd lost. I laid out everything for him. The documentation I'd kept of my work on various Lux Carter properties. The contracts bearing my signature as consultant. The correspondence showing my strategic input on acquisitions and renovations. The financial analyses demonstrating that properties I'd worked on significantly outperformed those where I hadn't been involved. Marcus reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes, his expression revealing nothing. "This is substantial," he finally said, looking up from the documents spread across his conference table. "You've been remarkably thorough in documenting your contributions. The challenge is that you weren't officially employed by Lux Carter. You were working as an unpaid consultant, which complicates compensation claims." "I don't want compensation," I clarified. "I want recognition. And I want to make it impossible for Dominic to continue profiting from relationships and concepts I developed." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "That's a different strategy entirely. Less about financial settlement, more about dismantling his competitive advantages. It's possible, but you need to understand the implications. This will be public, potentially messy. It will damage his reputation and possibly his business relationships. Are you prepared for that level of conflict?" The question hung in the air. Was I prepared to deliberately hurt someone I'd once loved? To actively work toward destroying what we'd built together? I thought about Dominic's contempt, about Candace's smug confidence, about years of invisible labor and stolen credit. The answer came easier than expected. He made himself clear that I was disposable, worthless to his vision. I replied evenly. "I'm simply taking him at his word. If I'm truly as inconsequential as he claimed, then my departure shouldn't affect anything. But if it does, if his empire starts crumbling without the foundation I provided, then everyone will know exactly what my contributions were worth." Marcus smiled, the expression of someone recognizing a worthy challenge. "Then let's get to work." The legal strategy Marcus outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than suing for compensation, which would take years and might not succeed given my unofficial status, we would systematically withdraw my labor and relationships from Lux Carter's operations. Every cultural consultant I'd brought into projects would be contacted and informed that I was no longer associated with the company. Every local artist whose work appeared in Lux Carter properties would be given the option to remove their pieces or renegotiate contracts directly rather than through Dominic's corporate structure. Every community partnership I'd fostered would be quietly informed that the person who'd built those bridges had left the organization. "This doesn't prevent him from operating," Marcus explained. "But it removes the authenticity that differentiated his properties from competitors. Without your cultural insights and community relationships, Lux Carter becomes just another luxury hotel chain. Generic, replicable, no longer special." The process would take months, Marcus warned. Building legal justification, reaching out to contacts, ensuring everything was done properly without exposing me to liability. I'd need to be patient, methodical. I'd also need income, since my savings from the marriage would cover basic expenses but not indefinitely. Gabby solved the employment problem with characteristic efficiency. Her digital marketing agency, Romano Creative, had been looking to expand their hospitality division. She offered me a position as Director of Cultural Strategy, focusing on helping boutique hotels and independent properties develop authentic brand identities. The salary was modest compared to what Dominic had been earning, but it was mine, earned through my own recognized labor rather than invisible contributions someone else claimed. My first project for Romano Creative was a struggling bed and breakfast in Fredericksburg, a small town in Texas Hill Country known for wineries and German heritage. The property had 15 rooms, beautiful grounds, and absolutely no distinct identity beyond generic luxury accommodations. The owners, an older couple named Helen and Robert Schmidt, had inherited the property from Helen's parents and were contemplating selling because occupancy rates had declined steadily for 3 years. I spent a week in Fredericksburg, much like I'd done in every city where Dominic had acquired properties. But this time, the research was officially mine, the recommendations would carry my name, and any success would be credited appropriately. I interviewed longtime residents about the town's German immigrant history, visited local wineries to understand regional wine culture, explored antique shops and art galleries discovering Texas artists working in traditional German folk art styles. The concept I developed for the Schmitz honored Fredericksburg's heritage while avoiding theme park kitsch. Each room would be redesigned to reflect a different aspect of hill country culture, featuring work by local artists and furniture from regional craftspeople. The dining experience would highlight German-influenced Texas cuisine using ingredients from nearby farms and ranches. Weekend programming would include wine education sessions, folk art workshops, and historical walking tours led by longtime residents. Helen cried when I presented the proposal, not from sadness but from recognition. "This is what we've been trying to articulate for years," she said, her hand gripping mine tightly. "We knew the property should honor our heritage, but every consultant we hired wanted to make us generic and modern. You actually listened to who we are." The Schmitz implemented my recommendations over 6 months, a complete transformation that required significant investment but remained true to the property's essential character. I documented every phase, building case studies that Gabby used to market Romano Creative services to other independent hospitality properties. By the time the redesigned bed and breakfast reopened, I'd signed 3 additional clients, all small properties looking for authentic differentiation in an increasingly homogenized industry. Meanwhile, Marcus was methodically executing our legal strategy against Lux Carter. The first phase involved contacting the cultural consultants I'd worked with across Dominic's various properties. A Cuban musician whose trio performed regularly at the Meridian in Miami. A gala basket weaver whose work was featured throughout the Charleston property. A Navajo jewelry designer whose pieces were sold in the Sedona Resorts Gallery. Each received a carefully worded letter explaining that I was no longer associated with Lux Carter and suggesting they might want to reconsider their contracts given the change in cultural oversight. The responses varied. Some consultants were confused, having assumed I was officially part of the company. Others were angry, feeling they'd been misled about who was actually ensuring authentic cultural representation. Several immediately terminated their contracts with Lux Carter, refusing to work with Dominic directly. The Cuban musician sent me a long email expressing hurt that I'd left without telling him personally, explaining that he'd only agreed to perform at the Meridian because of my commitment to honoring his heritage rather than exploiting it for ambience. Each withdrawal was a small earthquake in Lux Carter's operations. Not devastating individually, but cumulatively significant. Guest reviews began mentioning that properties felt different, less special, more generic. The Meridian's rooftop bar, once celebrated for authentic Caribbean atmosphere, started drawing complaints about manufactured tropical vibes. The Charleston property lost its gala basket weaver and couldn't find a replacement willing to work with corporate representatives who didn't understand the cultural significance of sweetgrass basketry. Dominic called repeatedly during this period, leaving increasingly hostile voicemails that Marcus advised me to save as documentation. The messages evolved from demanding I stop interfering with his business to threatening legal action to finally, desperately, asking what I wanted to make this stop. I didn't respond to any of them. Silence, Marcus explained, was more destabilizing than engagement. It denied Dominic the confrontation he wanted and left him unable to negotiate or manipulate. 3 months after I'd left Miami, Gabby and I were reviewing quarterly results for Romano Creative when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Victoria, this is Preston Clark. We met briefly at your husband's charity gala. I'm one of Lux Carter's primary investors, and I was hoping we could have a conversation." Preston Clark. I remembered him vaguely, an older man in an expensive suit who'd spent most of the gala talking to Dominic about expansion opportunities. I glanced at Gabby, who was watching curiously, then put the call on speaker. "What can I do for you, Mr. Clark?" I replied neutrally, giving nothing away. "I'll be direct," Preston said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "We've noticed significant operational changes at Lux Carter Properties over the past few months. Guest satisfaction scores are declining, several key cultural partnerships have dissolved, and properties that were previously outperforming projections are now barely meeting baseline expectations. After some investigation, it became clear that these changes correlate directly with your departure from the organization. I wasn't technically part of the organization, I corrected carefully. I was providing unpaid consulting services to my husband. Preston laughed, a dry sound without real humor. Yes, Dominic has been quite insistent about that distinction. But investors don't care about organizational charts, Mrs. Hayes. We care about performance. And the performance data suggests that whatever you were doing, paid or unpaid, official or unofficial, it was driving significant value that's now absent. Gabby was watching me with raised eyebrows, clearly impressed by this unexpected development. I took a breath, considering my response carefully. I appreciate your perspective, Mr. Clark, but I'm not sure what you're asking. I've moved on to other projects. My marriage is ending. I have no interest in returning to Lux Carter in any capacity. I'm not asking you to return, Preston clarified. I'm asking if you'd be willing to meet with several Lux Carter investors to discuss the nature of your contributions and why those contributions are no longer benefiting properties we've invested substantial capital into. We need to understand what we actually funded versus what Dominic claimed to be providing. The request was stunning in its implications. Dominic's own investors wanted to hear my version of events, wanted to understand the gap between the vision he'd sold them and the operational reality now becoming apparent. This was leverage I hadn't anticipated, an opportunity that went far beyond simply withdrawing my labor. I'd need to consult with my attorney, I replied slowly, my mind already racing through possibilities. But I'm potentially open to a conversation, provided it's properly documented and doesn't create legal liability for me. Understood completely, Preston agreed. Have your attorney contact me. We'll arrange something formal and ensure you're protected. Mrs. Hayes, between us, several investors are growing concerned that we may have backed the wrong person. The empire Dominic built appeared impressive, but if it was actually built on someone else's uncredited foundation, that changes our assessment considerably. After the call ended, Gabby and I sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then she started laughing, the kind of delighted, disbelieving laughter that emerges from unexpected victories. His own investors are turning on him, she said, shaking her head in amazement. Victoria, do you understand what this means? You didn't just remove your foundation from his empire. You've positioned yourself as the foundation investors actually want to build on. The meeting with Lux Carter investors happened 3 weeks later in a neutral conference room at a Houston hotel, chosen because it was inconvenient for everyone and therefore favored no particular party. Marcus accompanied me, having spent weeks preparing documentation and coaching me on what to share and what to strategically withhold. 6 investors attended, including Preston Clark, each representing significant capital stakes in Lux Carter's expansion. I presented for 90 minutes, walking through every major property acquisition, explaining my research methodology, showing how cultural insights had driven design decisions and guest experiences. I shared correspondence where Dominic had initially dismissed my ideas only to implement them later and claim credit. I showed financial analyses demonstrating that properties where I'd been deeply involved significantly outperformed those where I hadn't. The investors asked detailed questions, probing not just what I'd done but how replicable my approach was without me specifically. Could someone else do this cultural research? Possibly, I acknowledged, but it required genuine respect for communities rather than viewing them as aesthetic resources to exploit. It required building relationships over months, earning trust, demonstrating that you valued authentic representation over profitable stereotypes. Dominic had never understood that distinction, never valued the slow work of cultural bridge building. At the end of the presentation, the investors caucused privately while Marcus and I waited in an adjacent room. When they returned, Preston served as spokesperson. Mrs. Hayes, we're prepared to offer you a formal consulting contract, he began. Independent from Lux Carter, reporting directly to the investor group rather than to Dominic. Your role would be cultural oversight across all properties, with authority to approve or reject design decisions, partnership contracts, and guest experience programming. Compensation would be substantial, reflecting the value we now understand you were providing all along. The offer was tempting, validation that my work had genuine market value independent of my relationship with Dominic. But accepting would mean returning to Lux Carter's orbit, even if not directly under Dominic's authority. It would mean watching him continue to benefit from my labor, even if I was finally being properly compensated and credited. I appreciate the offer, I said slowly, working through my thoughts in real time. But I need to be honest with you. I don't want to fix Lux Carter. I've moved on to working with independent properties, helping them develop authentic identities without corporate pressure to prioritize returns over cultural integrity. That work is more aligned with my values than anything I could do within your organizational structure. The investors exchanged glances, and I sensed disappointment but also, surprisingly, respect. Preston leaned forward, his expression more personal than corporate. Then let me ask a different question, he said. If you were building your own hospitality company from scratch, one that prioritized cultural authenticity and community partnerships over rapid expansion and maximum returns, what would that look like? And hypothetically, would that be something investors interested in sustainable, values-driven growth might want to participate in? The question opened possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. My own company. Not supporting someone else's vision, but building something entirely mine. Properties that honored communities genuinely rather than exploiting them aesthetically. A business model that measured success not just in revenue but in positive cultural impact. Hypothetically, I replied, meeting Preston's eyes directly, it would look like everything Lux Carter could have been if the person making decisions actually cared about more than expansion and ego. It would be smaller, more selective, focused on quality over quantity. And it would require investors patient enough to prioritize long-term cultural sustainability over short-term returns. Hypothetically, Preston replied with a slight smile, there are investors increasingly interested in exactly that kind of approach. The hospitality industry is saturated with generic luxury brands. There's a market gap for something genuinely authentic, provided it's executed by someone who actually understands what authenticity means. We parted ways that afternoon with no formal agreements but with something potentially more valuable, mutual understanding that alternate futures were possible. The investors would continue funding Lux Carter's operations, but their confidence in Dominic had been fundamentally shaken. And I left Houston with the seed of an idea that had been planted, watered, and was now beginning to grow into something that felt like purpose rather than just employment. Back in Austin, Gabby and I spent long nights discussing what my own hospitality company might look like. Not hotels exactly, but something more aligned with bed and breakfast intimacy while maintaining professional standards. Cultural heritage properties, maybe, each one deeply rooted in its community's authentic identity. Properties that local residents would be proud of rather than resentful toward, that would enhance rather than exploit the places they occupied. The vision was ambitious, possibly naive, certainly risky. But for the first time since leaving Miami, I felt something beyond anger or hurt or determination. I felt excited. I felt creative. I felt like myself again, not a diminished version apologizing for taking up space but the full version that had existed before I'd learned to make myself smaller to fit someone else's vision of who I should be. Romano Creative continued growing, my hospitality division now accounting for 40% of the agency's revenue. The Schmidt's Bed and Breakfast in Fredericksburg was thriving, booked solid 6 months in advance, featured in Texas Monthly as an example of heritage tourism done right. My other clients were seeing similar results, not explosive growth but steady, sustainable success built on authentic differentiation rather than manufactured luxury. 6 months after leaving Miami, I was finally, genuinely happy. Not the performance of happiness I'd maintained during my marriage, but real contentment that came from work I believed in, relationships that valued me appropriately, and the freedom to make decisions aligned with my values. Charlie had adjusted beautifully to Austin, spending afternoons in Gabby's warehouse while I worked, going on long walks through the neighborhood each evening. Life was quieter than it had been in Miami, less glamorous certainly, but infinitely more authentic. Then Dominic showed up at my door. I opened the door to find Dominic standing in Gabby's warehouse courtyard looking diminished somehow, despite wearing what was probably a $3,000 suit. His face was thinner than I remembered, shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Charlie barked once from behind me, a warning rather than greeting, before settling back into wary observation. "Victoria, Dominic began, his voice lacking the commanding confidence I'd grown accustomed to. We need to talk. Please. Just give me 10 minutes. I should have closed the door immediately, should have refused engagement entirely. Instead, curiosity won out over caution. I wanted to understand what had brought him to Austin, what desperation had driven him to my doorstep after months of silence following those hostile voicemails. 10 minutes, I agreed, stepping aside but not inviting him in. We can talk on the patio. Gabi's warehouse had a small courtyard space with a wrought iron table and mismatched chairs, morning glories climbing the brick wall providing shade from the Texas sun. I sat across from Dominic, maintaining physical distance, keeping my expression neutral. He fidgeted with his watch, a nervous gesture I'd never seen during our marriage. Lux Carter is falling apart, he said abruptly, abandoning whatever diplomatic approach he'd planned. Guest satisfaction scores have dropped 15% across all properties in the last quarter. 3 major investors are threatening to pull funding. The cultural partnerships you established are gone, and I can't find anyone to replace them who understands what you were actually doing. The Meridian just lost its 5-star rating. I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though satisfaction hummed quietly beneath my carefully maintained composure. Everything I'd predicted was manifesting exactly as I'd expected. Without the authentic cultural foundation I'd built, Dominic's empire was revealing itself as the hollow construct it had always been. That's unfortunate, I replied evenly. But I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because I need you to come back, Dominic said, desperation creeping into his tone. Not as my wife, I understand that's finished. But as an official consultant, properly compensated, with full credit for your work. Help me fix what's breaking, Victoria. Please. The plea would have meant everything a year ago. Recognition, finally. Acknowledgement of my value. Proper compensation and credit. Everything I'd wanted while invisible and unappreciated. Now it felt like too little, arriving far too late, motivated entirely by his crisis rather than any genuine recognition of past wrongs. You told me I was worthless to your vision, I reminded him quietly. That you'd rather kiss our dog than be intimate with me. That I represented everything about your past you were trying to move beyond. Why would I help someone who holds me in such contempt? Dominic flinched, the words landing as intended. I was angry, he said weakly. Stressed. I said things I didn't mean in the heat of the moment. No, I corrected, my voice hardening. You said things you absolutely meant but weren't supposed to say out loud. You revealed exactly how you'd always seen me, just usually with enough diplomacy to keep me compliant and working. That honesty, as brutal as it was, freed me. So thank you for that, actually. He tried different approaches over the next 8 minutes. Financial incentives, promising me equity in the company. Strategic authority, swearing I'd have final approval on all cultural decisions. Even personal appeals, suggesting we could rebuild our friendship if not our marriage. Each offer felt more hollow than the last, transparently transactional, devoid of genuine remorse or understanding of the deeper harm he'd caused. When the 10 minutes expired, I stood, ending the conversation before he could pivot to another angle. I'm rebuilding my career on my own terms now, Dominic. Working with properties that value authenticity from the start rather than seeing it as damage control for declining ratings. Your empire's collapse isn't my problem to solve. You'll figure it out, I'm sure. You're very good at taking credit for other people's work. Try actually doing the work yourself this time. I walked inside without waiting for his response, locking the door behind me. Through the window, I watched him sit motionless at the patio table for several minutes before finally standing and walking away. Charlie pressed against my leg, offering silent support, somehow understanding that I needed reassurance despite my outward composure. Gabby found me 20 minutes later still standing by the window, staring at nothing. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a glass of wine and sat beside me on the couch until I was ready to talk. He wanted me to fix everything, I finally said. To come back and repair the damage my absence caused. As if that's acknowledgement rather than just more exploitation. What did you tell him? Gabby asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew. I told him to figure it out himself. That I'm done solving problems for people who don't value the solutions. Gabby raised her glass in a quiet toast. To solving problems for people who actually deserve your brilliance. The confrontation with Dominic clarified something I'd been circling around without fully committing to. I didn't just want to consult for other properties anymore. I wanted to build my own, to create from the foundation up rather than trying to retrofit authenticity into existing structures. The vision Preston Clark had prompted during that Houston meeting had been growing, evolving, becoming more concrete as I worked with independent properties and saw what was possible outside corporate constraints. I spent the next 3 weeks developing a comprehensive business plan. Not just conceptual vision but detailed financial projections, market analysis, operational frameworks. The model I designed was deliberately small-scale, focused on acquiring and renovating properties with genuine cultural significance rather than building new structures. Historic buildings in communities overlooked by major hospitality chains, places where tourism could support rather than displace local culture. The first property I identified was a closed theater in San Antonio's historic district, a beautiful 1920s building that had once been the cultural heart of the Mexican-American community. The theater had been shuttered for a decade, too expensive for the nonprofit that owned it to maintain but too culturally significant to demolish. My vision was transforming it into a boutique hotel that preserved the theater's architectural integrity while creating spaces for performances, art exhibitions, cultural programming. A hotel that would be an active community gathering place rather than a destination that existed separate from its surroundings. But I also understand if you're hesitant about partnership after what you've experienced. Preston filled me in on some background with Lux Carter. The transparency was unexpected and appreciated. Most people danced carefully around my failed marriage, treating it as something awkward to avoid rather than relevant context for understanding my current caution. I'm hesitant, I admitted. My last partnership became exploitative because I didn't establish clear boundaries or demand proper recognition from the start. I won't repeat those patterns. Adrian nodded slowly. Then let me suggest something. We structure this as a genuine 50-50 partnership with clearly defined roles and decision-making authority. You handle all cultural strategy, community relationships, design vision. I manage operations, finance, systems development. Major decisions require agreement from both of us. Neither of us can claim the other's work or diminish the other's contributions. We build formal structures that prevent the kind of erasure you experienced before. The proposal was exactly what I needed to hear, acknowledgement of past harm combined with concrete mechanisms to prevent repetition. We spent another 2 hours that afternoon sketching out partnership terms, discovering that our working styles complemented each other naturally. Adrian thought systematically, building frameworks and processes. I thought culturally, seeing patterns and possibilities in community dynamics. Neither approach was superior, both were necessary. By the time we left the coffee shop, we'd agreed to move forward with a trial period. Adrian would consult on the San Antonio project for 3 months, helping develop operational plans and financial models while I finalized community partnerships and design concepts. If collaboration worked smoothly, we'd formalize the partnership and pursue Heritage Collective funding together. The 3-month trial revealed that Adrian was exactly the partner I'd needed without realizing it. He built financial projections that proved the San Antonio theater could be both culturally vibrant and economically sustainable. He developed operational systems that maintained hospitality standards without sacrificing authentic character. Most importantly, he consistently credited my work accurately, introducing me to potential investors as the cultural vision behind the project rather than positioning himself as the primary leader. Working with Adrian felt fundamentally different from working with Dominic. There was no competition for recognition, no subtle diminishment of contributions, no claiming credit for ideas he hadn't generated. When investors asked questions about cultural strategy, Adrian directed them to me. When I struggled with financial modeling, he explained concepts patiently without condescension. The partnership felt balanced, respectful, collaborative in ways my marriage never had been. For months after we began working together, the Heritage Collective officially funded acquisition of the San Antonio theater property. The investment was substantial, enough to purchase the building and fund complete renovation while maintaining financial reserves for operational launch. Adrian and I became official partners, forming a company we named Rooted Hospitality with mission statement emphasizing cultural preservation, community partnership, and sustainable tourism. The renovation took 8 months, a careful process of preserving architectural details while updating infrastructure for modern hospitality needs. I worked closely with San Antonio's Mexican-American arts community, ensuring the design honored the theater's cultural significance. Local artisans created custom furniture pieces. Muralists painted the lobby with scenes depicting the building's history. Musicians who performed in the original theater were invited to play at the reopening celebration. Adrian meanwhile built operational systems, hired staff, developed booking platforms, established relationships with travel agents specializing in cultural tourism. He handled the countless tedious but essential details that made the difference between charming concept and professionally managed property. The opening celebration felt surreal, standing in the renovated theater surrounded by community members who remembered when the building had been culturally vital, seeing their genuine joy at its restoration. Local television covered the event, not just as business news but as cultural preservation story. Guests booked rooms not despite the property's cultural mission but because of it, drawn by authenticity that felt increasingly rare in standardized hospitality industry. During the celebration, Adrian pulled me aside briefly. "This is what partnership should look like," he said quietly. "Both of us building something neither could create alone. Equal credit, equal authority, equal investment. I'm honored to be doing this work with you, Victoria." The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. This was what I'd wanted in my marriage and never received, genuine recognition without needing to demand it, partnership based on mutual respect rather than one person's convenience. Rooted Hospitality's first property exceeded occupancy projections within 2 months of opening. Guests left reviews praising the cultural authenticity, the integration with local community, the sense of place that felt earned rather than manufactured. The success attracted attention from other communities with culturally significant buildings seeking preservation solutions, from investors interested in impact-driven hospitality, from media outlets writing about sustainable tourism. Adrian and I began evaluating potential second property acquisitions, prioritizing communities where tourism could support rather than displace local culture. The respect that had characterized our working relationship extended seamlessly into developing romance. 3 months later, Adrian proposed during a site visit to the New Mexico hacienda. Nothing elaborate, just the two of us standing in the restored courtyard at sunset, him taking my hand and asking if I wanted to build a life together alongside building our company. The proposal acknowledged both dimensions of our partnership, personal and professional intertwined but not confused. I said yes without hesitation, certain in ways I'd never been with Dominic. This wasn't about rescue or status or filling empty spaces. This was about two complete people choosing to combine their strengths, building something together that honored both individuals while creating something larger than either could achieve alone. Our engagement remained private initially, shared only with Gabby and close friends. We'd announce it publicly when the timing felt right, when it wouldn't overshadow Rooted Hospitality's mission or create questions about professional dynamics. For now, it was simply ours, the quiet foundation beneath public success. Rooted Hospitality continued expanding, acquiring the New Mexico hacienda and breaking ground on the North Carolina mill renovation. Each property strengthened our reputation, attracting additional investor interest and media coverage. We hired a small team, carefully selecting people who understood the cultural mission alongside hospitality expertise. A year after leaving Miami, I was unrecognizably different from the diminished person I'd been. Confident, recognized, building something meaningful with someone who valued me appropriately. The empire I was creating wasn't built on exploitation or stolen credit. It was built on authentic partnerships, cultural respect, and genuine collaboration. Everything was finally, genuinely good. Which meant, inevitably, the past was about to demand one final confrontation. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, embossed lettering announcing the Southwest Hospitality Excellence Award ceremony in Phoenix. Rooted Hospitality had been nominated for Emerging Brand of the Year, recognition that validated everything Adrian and I had built over the past 18 months. The ceremony would bring together industry leaders, investors, and media from across the region. It was exactly the kind of visibility our growing company needed. What made my stomach clench wasn't the event itself but the list of other nominees and attendees included in the information packet. Lux Carter Hotels and Resorts was nominated in 3 categories, including Dominic personally for industry leadership recognition. He would be there. Candace would likely accompany him. After a year of careful distance, of building my life in spaces where our paths wouldn't cross, we would be in the same ballroom for an evening of professional networking and forced civility. Adrian found me staring at the invitation in our shared office space, my coffee growing cold beside untouched breakfast. He read over my shoulder, immediately understanding the source of my tension. "We don't have to go," he said simply. "Awards are nice but not essential. I won't put you in an uncomfortable situation for professional recognition." His immediate willingness to skip the event because of my discomfort exemplified why our partnership worked. But declining felt like retreat, like allowing Dominic's presence to dictate my choices. I'd spent 18 months building something extraordinary, proving my value independently. Avoiding him now would suggest I was still defined by what he'd done rather than what I'd accomplished since leaving. "No," I said decisively. "We're going. Rooted hospitality deserves this recognition. I deserve to be in that room, receiving acknowledgement for work that's actually mine. Dominic's presence doesn't change that." Adrian studied my face carefully. "If you're certain. But the moment it becomes too much, we leave. Your well-being matters more than any award." The weeks leading up to the ceremony were consumed with final preparations for the North Carolina mill property opening and ongoing work at the New Mexico hacienda. The pace left little time to obsess about the upcoming encounter with Dominic, which was probably beneficial. When I did think about it, I focused on practical details. What to wear, how to respond if he approached me, strategies for maintaining composure regardless of what he might say. Gabby flew to Phoenix with us, declaring herself my emotional support and amateur bodyguard. She'd never forgiven Dominic for the cruelty I'd shared, and her protective presence felt reassuring. The 3 of us checked into a downtown hotel, not one of Lux Carter's properties obviously, and spent the afternoon before the ceremony reviewing talking points for potential media interviews and investor conversations. I chose my outfit carefully, a midnight blue dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, professional while still acknowledging the formal nature of the event. Adrian wore a tailored charcoal suit, looking polished in a way that highlighted how much more comfortable he was in his own skin compared to Dominic's performative confidence. Gabby appointed herself photographer, documenting our preparation with the efficiency of someone who understood these moments mattered. The award ceremony took place in a resort ballroom, all soaring ceilings and dramatic lighting designed to impress. Round tables filled the space, each seating 8, place cards directing guests to assigned seats that mixed companies to encourage networking. Adrian and I were placed at a table with representatives from 2 other boutique hotel groups, a travel writer from a major magazine, and a sustainable tourism consultant I'd long admired. Approached during dinner service, when Adrian had stepped away to take a call and Gabby was networking with the travel writer. He slid into Adrian's empty chair with presumptuous familiarity, his expression harder than during our earlier encounter. "Congratulations," he said flatly. "I'm sure this feels like vindication. Proof you didn't need me or Lux Carter to succeed." I set down my fork carefully, meeting his gaze directly. "This isn't about you, Dominic. It never was. This is about building something meaningful, something aligned with my values. Your opinion of it is irrelevant." His jaw clenched at the dismissal. "You took everything I built and repackaged it as your own concept. The cultural partnerships, the community integration, those were Lux Carter strategies you're now claiming as innovation." The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that I almost laughed. "Those were my strategies that you claimed as Lux Carter innovations. I built every cultural partnership you profited from. I developed every community relationship that differentiated your properties. You took credit for my work for years. I simply stopped allowing that theft to continue." "That's not how I remember it," Dominic insisted, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "We built those properties together. It was collaborative work." "Collaborative suggests equal contribution and shared credit," I corrected. What we had was me working invisibly while you accepted all recognition. There's a significant difference. One you're apparently still unable or unwilling to acknowledge. Before Dominic could respond, Adrian returned, immediately reading the tension. He didn't ask Dominic to move but simply stood behind his chair, presence alone making clear the seat was occupied. Dominic stood reluctantly, his expression cycling through anger and something that might have been regret before settling on defensive pride. "Enjoy your moment, Victoria," he said. "We'll see how sustainable your model is when you're not riding the novelty factor. Real hospitality empires require scale and efficiency, not just cultural window dressing." He walked away before I could respond, returning to his table where Candace was watching with undisguised curiosity. Adrian reclaimed his seat, his hand finding mine immediately. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," I replied, surprised to realize it was true. His insults don't land anymore. He's trying to diminish what we've built because watching me succeed without him threatens his entire narrative about my incompetence. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a blur of congratulations and networking conversations. Lux Carter won nothing in their nominated categories, overlooked in favor of brands demonstrating innovation or sustainable growth. I watched Dominic's face darken with each award he didn't receive, the evening becoming not just my triumph but his very public diminishment. The after-party took place in an adjacent ballroom, cocktails and dancing, industry professionals mixing with the relaxed informality alcohol encouraged. Adrian and I made rounds, thanking people for their support, discussing potential collaborations, solidifying relationships that would benefit Rooted Hospitality's continued growth. Gabby documented everything, her phone capturing moments of celebration I knew I'd want to remember. I was getting champagne from the bar when I felt someone approach too closely, invading personal space in a way that immediately set off warning signals. I turned to find Candace Wellington, her red dress even more dramatic under the party lighting, her smile sharp and calculated. "Victoria," she said, her tone dripping false warmth. "I wanted to personally congratulate you. Tonight must feel like quite the accomplishment after everything you've been through." The phrasing was deliberately ambiguous, could be interpreted as supportive or mocking depending on delivery. Candace's expression suggested the latter. I accepted my champagne from the bartender before responding, using the moment to compose myself. "It's been a rewarding evening," I replied neutrally. "Rooted Hospitality's recognition validates a lot of hard work." Candace's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure it does. Though I have to say, your business model seems rather limited. How many culturally significant properties can you realistically acquire and renovate? Dominic always said your approach didn't scale, that emotional attachment to places prevented the kind of expansion real hospitality brands require." The criticism was clearly coming from Dominic, his words delivered through Candace as proxy attack. I considered several responses before settling on one that addressed the fundamental misunderstanding driving their contempt. "Candace," I said calmly, "scale isn't the only measure of success. Rooted Hospitality prioritizes depth over breadth, meaningful impact over maximum properties. We're building something sustainable that actually matters to communities rather than extracting value from them. If that model doesn't appeal to you or Dominic, that's fine. You're welcome to continue pursuing whatever strategy works for Lux Carter. But don't mistake different values for inferior ones." Her smile faltered slightly, not expecting direct challenge. Before she could formulate a response, Preston Clark appeared at my elbow, his timing impeccable as always. "Victoria, congratulations again," he said warmly, effectively inserting himself into the conversation. "The Heritage Collective is thrilled with tonight's outcome. Several of us were just discussing potential investment in your Louisiana Bayou property. Could I steal you for a few minutes to talk specifics?" I excused myself from Candace with polite finality, following Preston to a quieter corner where several Heritage Collective investors were gathered. They wanted to discuss accelerating Rooted Hospitality's expansion timeline, offering additional capital to acquire and renovate properties faster than our current pace allowed. "We're seeing remarkable returns on the San Antonio property," Preston explained. "Not just financially, though those numbers are strong. But community impact, positive press coverage, the kind of brand differentiation that creates lasting value. We want to fund more of this work, Victoria." How many properties could you reasonably manage in the next 3 years if capital wasn't the limiting factor? The conversation shifted to strategic planning, discussion of which markets offered the best opportunities for cultural heritage properties, how to scale operations while maintaining the authentic relationships that made our model work. Adrian joined us, contributing operational perspective while I focused on cultural feasibility and community partnership potential. We were deep in this discussion when I noticed Dominic across the room, watching our group with obvious frustration. He was seeing the same investors who'd once funded his expansion now gathered around me, offering capital for my vision while his company struggled to maintain existing properties. The power dynamic couldn't have been clearer if we'd staged it deliberately. Later that evening, as the party wound down and guests began departing, I found myself briefly alone on the terrace outside the ballroom, needing air and momentary solitude to process everything that had happened. The Phoenix night was cool, desert temperature dropping significantly after sunset, city lights spreading across the valley below. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting Adrian or Gabby. Instead, Dominic emerged from the ballroom, his jacket removed, tie loosened, looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. We stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the party muted behind closed doors. "I underestimated you," he said finally, his voice lacking the defensive edge from earlier confrontations. Not just professionally, though obviously I did that catastrophically. But fundamentally, as a person. I convinced myself you needed me to succeed, that your contributions were only valuable within the structure I provided. Tonight proved how completely wrong I was. The admission felt like something he owed me, recognition arriving years late but still carrying weight. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch while I decided whether this conversation served any purpose beyond his need for absolution. "You didn't just underestimate me," I said eventually. "You erased me. Systematically took credit for my work, dismissed my value, then discarded me when someone shinier appeared. That wasn't misjudgment, Dominic. That was deliberate cruelty." He flinched but didn't argue. "I know. And I've lost everything because of it. Lux Carter is failing. Investors are pulling funding. Properties I thought were successful are revealing themselves as barely functional without the foundation you provided. Candace," he paused, laughing bitterly. "Candace turned out to be excellent at networking and terrible at everything else. The relationship I destroyed my marriage for lasted 6 months before she moved on to someone with better prospects. The information should have felt satisfying, vindication that everything he'd chosen over me had proven hollow. Instead, I just felt tired. His suffering didn't undo the pain he'd caused or validate the years I'd spent invisible. It was simply the natural consequences of his choices catching up with him. "I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry for your situation," I said quietly. "Because I'm not. You created these consequences through your actions. But I also don't feel satisfaction watching you struggle, Dominic. I just feel done. Done with anger, done with carrying what you did to me. I've built something beautiful with people who value me appropriately. Your opinion of me, your success or failure, none of it affects my life anymore." Dominic was quiet, staring out at the city lights rather than meeting my eyes. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I am sorry. For all of it. You deserved better than how I treated you. And watching you tonight, seeing what you've built, I understand exactly how much I lost when I convinced myself you were disposable." The apology was probably as genuine as he was capable of offering, acknowledgement without excuses or qualification. It didn't change anything, didn't repair damage or restore what had been broken. But it was something, closure of a kind I hadn't realized I needed until receiving it. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope you figure out whatever comes next for you, Dominic. I genuinely do. But that journey doesn't involve me anymore." I walked back into the ballroom, leaving him alone on the terrace with his regrets and consequences. Adrian was waiting just inside, holding my wrap, ready to leave whenever I wanted. Gabby stood beside him, the three of us forming the chosen family I'd built from the ruins of what I'd left behind. "Ready to go?" Adrian asked, reading my expression accurately. I nodded, taking his offered arm. We collected our things, said final goodbyes to the Heritage Collective investors and industry contacts we'd connected with throughout the evening. As we walked through the resort lobby toward the exit, I caught my reflection in a massive mirror. The woman looking back was confident, successful, surrounded by people who valued her genuinely. She bore little resemblance to the diminished person who'd fled Miami 18 months earlier. The taxi ride back to our hotel was quiet, the three of us processing the evening in companionable silence. Gabby eventually broke it with characteristic directness. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Seeing him, hearing whatever he said on that terrace, receiving the recognition he tried to deny you. How does all of it feel now that it's over?" I considered the question carefully before answering. Like closing a chapter that needed ending. Tonight wasn't about revenge or proving him wrong. It was about standing in my truth, being recognized for work that's genuinely mine, and realizing that his opinion genuinely doesn't matter anymore. I've built something he can't touch or diminish. That's the real victory. Adrian kissed the top of my head, the gesture affectionate and proud. "You were remarkable tonight. Gracious with him when you had every right to be cruel, confident without needing to diminish anyone else. Everything you've become would be impressive under any circumstances, but knowing what you overcame to get here makes it extraordinary." Back at the hotel, we celebrated properly with room service champagne and genuine joy at how far we'd come. The award sat on the dresser, crystal catching light from the city outside our window. It represented recognition, certainly, validation of our work and vision. But more importantly, it represented reclamation. Taking back the value that had been stolen, rebuilding identity on my own terms, creating success that belonged completely to me. I'd walked into that ceremony uncertain how I'd react to seeing Dominic, worried his presence might trigger old insecurities or painful memories. Instead, I'd discovered something liberating. He no longer had power over me. His cruelty had lost its sting, his opinions their weight. I'd transformed the girl he'd dismissed into a woman building an empire on her own terms, and no amount of his regret or acknowledgement could diminish that achievement. The confrontation I dreaded had become the closure I'd needed. Permission to fully release the past and embrace the future I was creating. Whatever came next for Rooted Hospitality, whatever challenges or opportunities lay ahead, I would face them with clarity about my worth and certainty about my vision. Dominic had told me he'd rather kiss a dog than touch me, treating me as something beneath contempt. Tonight, he'd watched me accept industry recognition while his empire crumbled, witnessed investors choosing my vision over his, seen concrete evidence of exactly what he'd lost when he discarded me as worthless. That wasn't revenge. It was simply truth, revealing itself in ways that needed no embellishment or exaggeration. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't retaliation but transformation, becoming so thoroughly yourself that the person who tried to diminish you becomes irrelevant to your story. I fell asleep that night in Adrian's arms, the award visible from the bed, future possibilities spreading before me like the desert landscape outside our window. Vast, full of potential, entirely mine to explore. 2 years after that award ceremony in Phoenix, I stood in the courtyard of our 5th Rooted Hospitality property, a restored mission building in Southern California that had taken 14 months to renovate properly. The opening celebration brought together everyone who'd supported the journey, Heritage Collective investors, local community members whose heritage we'd honored, staff we'd trained in cultural hospitality principles, and media covering what had become a recognized movement in sustainable tourism. Adrian stood beside me, no longer just my business partner but my husband of 6 months. We'd married quietly at the New Mexico hacienda, surrounded by close friends and the community members who'd embraced our first major project. The ceremony had been simple, vows we'd written ourselves that emphasized partnership, mutual respect, and building something meaningful together. Everything my first marriage hadn't been. Gabby had served as my witness, her agency now handling marketing for a dozen hospitality brands inspired by our model. She'd become the leading voice in authentic cultural branding, frequently speaking at conferences about storytelling that honored rather than exploited communities. Our friendship had deepened through proximity and shared success, regular dinners where we celebrated victories and strategized through challenges. The mission property represented everything we'd learned about balancing preservation with viability. Local artisans had created custom furnishings using traditional techniques. The restaurant featured indigenous ingredients prepared by chefs from the nearby Chumash community. Guest programming included language classes, traditional craft workshops, and historical tours led by tribal members. Revenue supported both property operations and direct community cultural programs. This was hospitality as partnership, exactly what I'd envisioned during those early Austin days when the concept felt more dream than possibility. Preston Clark approached during the reception, champagne glass in hand, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose investment thesis had proven spectacularly correct. The Heritage Collective had more than tripled their initial capital through rooted hospitality returns while supporting cultural preservation they genuinely believed in. Other investors were approaching Preston constantly now, seeking opportunities in similar mission-driven ventures. "You've built something remarkable, Victoria," he said warmly. "Not just financially successful properties, though they certainly are that, but a completely new model for hospitality industry. You've proven cultural authenticity and business viability aren't competing values but complementary ones." His words carried weight beyond politeness. Industry publications were writing case studies about our approach. Hospitality schools were incorporating our model into curriculum. Competitors were attempting to replicate our success, though most struggled because they approached cultural partnerships transactionally rather than relationally. You couldn't manufacture what we'd built through authentic respect and patient relationship development. I'd received multiple acquisition offers over the past year, luxury conglomerates wanting to absorb rooted hospitality into their portfolios. The financial terms were substantial, enough to retire comfortably and never work again. Adrian and I had discussed each offer seriously, considering what selling might enable. But ultimately, we'd declined them all. This wasn't about building something to sell. This was about creating lasting impact, properties that would honor communities for generations rather than delivering short-term returns to shareholders. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I checked it. The text was from Dominic, somehow having obtained my new contact information despite my efforts to maintain distance. "Saw the article about the California property in hospitality today. Congratulations on everything you've built. I meant what I said in Phoenix. You've created something I never could have imagined. I hope you're happy, Victoria. You deserve to be." The message carried no request for response, no attempt to re-establish contact beyond this single acknowledgement. I showed it to Adrian, who read it thoughtfully before handing my phone back. "How do you feel about that?" he asked, always checking in rather than assuming. I considered the question honestly. Grateful that he can finally see clearly, I suppose. But mostly indifferent. His acknowledgement doesn't change anything about my life or my happiness. Those things exist completely independent of his opinion. Adrian smiled, pulling me close. That's growth. When someone's recognition stops mattering because you've built security in your own worth. I deleted the message without responding, returning my attention to the celebration happening around us. Community members were teaching guests a traditional dance, laughter and music filling the mission courtyard. This was what success actually looked like. Not champagne toasts in penthouses or 5-star ratings in luxury magazines, though we had those too. Real success was creating spaces where culture was honored, where communities benefited from tourism rather than being displaced by it, where business served something larger than just profit. Later that evening, after guests had departed and staff had finished cleanup, Adrian and I walked through the Mission Gardens in comfortable silence. The California night was mild, jasmine scent drifting on gentle breeze, mission bells visible against darkening sky. "Do you ever miss it?" Adrian asked quietly. The scale Dominic was pursuing, the empire building, the prestige of running something massive? I thought about his question, considering honestly rather than offering easy reassurance. Sometimes I wonder what that path would have looked like if I'd been properly valued from the start. But no, I don't miss it. I prefer depth over breadth. I prefer building 5 properties that genuinely matter over 50 that are just profitable. I prefer partnership that honors both people over hierarchy that elevates one at the other's expense. Adrian kissed me softly, the gesture carrying understanding and appreciation. We've built something extraordinary together. Not despite choosing smaller scale but because of it. That's worth more than any empire. We walked back toward the mission in companionable silence, hands linked, future spreading before us with possibilities I'd never imagined during those devastating Miami days. The girl who'd been told she was worthless, who'd fled with nothing but determination and a golden retriever, had rebuilt herself into someone unrecognizable from that broken starting point. Dominic's cruelty, as devastating as it had been, had ultimately freed me to discover what I was capable of creating when no longer constrained by someone else's limited vision of my worth. His empire had crumbled while mine flourished, not because I'd sought revenge but because I'd built authentically while he'd built on stolen foundations. The greatest victory wasn't his suffering or my success in isolation. It was the peace I'd found in understanding that his opinion of me had never reflected truth, only his own limitations. I'd transformed pain into purpose, betrayal into breakthrough, dismissal into determination that changed an entire industry's approach to cultural hospitality. Standing in that mission courtyard with Adrian, surrounded by evidence of everything we'd built together, I understood finally and completely that I'd won. Not against Dominic specifically, but against every voice that had ever suggested I was less than enough. I'd proven them wrong simply by becoming fully, authentically, powerfully myself. And that was the sweetest triumph of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.